Good evening, everyone. Understanding reincarnation. We may be thinking the following. Reincarnation is such a fundamental aspect of Spiritism. Why even bother coming to the talk? Maybe you might have thought, I know reincarnation, I'm Spiritist, or perhaps I've heard of it already, I'm familiar. I want the more juicy topics like mediumship, manifestations. And those are all really interesting. Those are all really interesting topics. But reincarnation is even more fascinating because it goes to the core and can touch our hearts. Let's explain why. If Kardec were here, he definitely would use modern day occurrences, things that are going on. He'd probably use social media. He probably would use Twitter, maybe, for positive, for good reasons. He probably wouldn't, post nonsense or anything. I'm sure he would use it for positive reasons. But as we said and mentioned during our prayer and our vibrations for the recent tragedy that occurred in Newtown, Connecticut, it is something that has touched our hearts profoundly, and it pertains to today's topic, believe it or not. Because it is in this part of Spiritism, in this belief, that we find our solace, our comfort. And we'll talk about that today. But one of the things we wanted to bring up and mention is this quote-unquote tragedy that really, truly pulls at our heartstrings. And even for us as Spiritists or non-Spiritists, religious, non-religious, spiritual, not spiritual, everybody on every social media is questioning why. And it forces us to question our own faith, even as Spiritists. Wow, what a tragedy. And perhaps we even begin to think, what was the reincarnatory plan? Was that meant to happen? I mean, where were the good spirits when that young guy was going into the elementary school? Because there are cases where the good spirits intervene and they block people from committing a tragedy. So why not then? Why not with my child? And secondly, for those mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and grandfathers and grandmothers, neighbors of people who this tragedy has touched directly, how do we comfort their hearts? Do we come with the Spirit's book and say, oh, we'll read it. You lost your child, but, read it. You'll be comforted. Is that going to comfort their heart? When the child that they probably just bought all their Christmas gifts for, maybe, some of us haven't, or Hanukkah gifts, or Kwanzaa gifts, whatever. And now, nothing. Once a home that was filled with laughter, noise, there's nothing. How does Spiritism come and comfort those hearts? How do we, who we are not scholars, not yet, maybe in next incarnation we'll become scholars in Spiritism, how do we humbly comfort those hearts? In part today, we don't even begin to take responsibility to say, in this talk, you will learn everything. Our talks are meant to be what a trailer is to a movie. You watch the trailer, it's not the whole movie. You get a gist, you kind of see like, yeah, I want to see the movie, no, I don't want to see the movie. Our talks, our lectures, our workshops are about giving a teaser into a book, or the books, or the literature of Spiritism. It's not meant to teach you everything, but it's just meant to tickle you a little bit. To say, ooh, let me read a little bit more. That touches my heart. So understanding reincarnation, we understand that this terminology, this belief system existed before Spiritism. It existed in many different other religions, belief systems, in Asia and everywhere across the globe. There's many different belief systems. So one of the most famous conversations that ever occurred, at least as in the Christian world, and for us Spiritists, one of the interesting conversations that ever took place was with Nicodemus and Jesus, and probably you all are aware of it, but it's interesting to note. It's a conversation that Nicodemus had with Jesus, and most of us know about it because the flesh gives birth to flesh. A lot of us can even quote that. But the conversation we shortened, and it goes like this. Jesus said to Nicodemus, "I tell you the truth, no one can see the kingdom of God unless he is born again." And Nicodemus asked, "How can a man be born when he is old?" So you can imagine Nicodemus is scratching his head, and he was considered to be a wise man. Jesus answered, "I tell you the truth, no one can enter the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, unless he is born of water and the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but Spirit gives birth to spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying, you must be born again." And this is in John chapter 13, verses 1 through 12. You can go read the more elaborate, unabridged version. And many modern religions take this, and out of this one statement was born the sect of Christianity, the born-again Christians, because they thought, okay, well, Jesus said I must be born again, so I'm going to be a born-again Christian. That's okay. You know what? There's nothing wrong with that. In actuality, there's really nothing wrong with it. It's something good. People want to feel renewed, so they consider themselves born again. We're not even downing them for that. But from a spiritist perspective, when we read this, it makes sense to us when they point out that flesh gives birth to flesh, but spirit gives birth to spirit. One is matter, one is of spiritual nature. And being born of the water and the Spirit, which is in the woman's womb. So if you go and read the longer version of it, you get more of an idea as well. But something for us to think about, that it is mentioned here. I believe there's a total of 5 chapters it's mentioned in, and once in I believe it's in Ecclesiastes, and it's kind of what's the word I'm searching for? Some believe it, some don't, and it's in Paul who wrote the letter to the Ecclesiastes. He mentions that, Paul the Apostle, that man only dies once. So it's kind of controversial. That's the word I'm looking for. Controversial. Because actually that text, some scholars believe that Paul didn't say that, or that wasn't Paul who said it. So it's controversial. So some can say, well, what about Paul? Because we love Paul, Stephen and Paul. But there are scholars, biblical scholars, who don't believe that text actually even belonged to Paul. Something interesting. So it is throughout the Bible as well, and we'll get to that. But what is the root word of reincarnation? Because we love looking at words and understanding them and the significance they have in our society. Because re, meaning to come again, and incarnate, coming from the Latin incarnatus, to make flesh, or carno, flesh. So coming again in the flesh. In a modern dictionary, such as the Oxford Dictionary, they actually define it as the rebirth of a soul in another body. Just so we have an idea of these definitions. But if we can open a parentheses here, or sort of do a sidebar, Kardec, for obvious reasons, he uses the word soul and spirit, and he defines each one. When Kardec in the literature, when they say soul, it refers to a spirit that is incarnate, and when they say spirit, they're referring to a discarnate. Did we get that? This is just from the Oxford Dictionary. This is not out of one of the spiritist literature, but it's just, there's a lot of dictionaries, which is amazing to us, because a lot of people don't believe reincarnation, but there is a lot of people who do. And there was statistics that were out there that some 2 million people believe in the U.S. in reincarnation. So it is a common belief. People have heard of it. It's not something where nobody knows about it. It's never been heard of before. You can Google it. It's all over the place. You Google it, you get like 1 million hits. But how does this tie into what we first mentioned? It does. We'll begin to understand the purpose behind defining all of this. Because if we take the tragedy of today, and there's many tragedies that occur, some in China, some in Africa, some that never even make it to the news, tragedies that occur. This one happened to make it to the news. So in one life versus many lives, how could we possibly make amends, given the perfect example of the young man who was not well, obviously, who committed these crimes yesterday? How could he fix everything that he did in one life? Logically speaking, you couldn't. No one could. Why are some children born as geniuses? Did they just acquire that in one life? It really wouldn't make any logical sense. So the principle of reincarnation is based on the natural consequence of the law of progress. We are all marching towards this progress. And in one lifetime, it's impossible for us to become perfect. We cannot learn all that there is to learn in simply one lifetime. And this we can read in the Genesis. And also, how do we explain young children, such as today, that were killed? Where is God's justice if there only exists one life? Small little tidbit that, at least for us who weren't directly hit with this tragedy, we can use our reasoning and say, well, we know that we have many lives, that the wrongdoer today can turn into the saint tomorrow. We don't mean that literally, but the cause of our present day afflictions are from where? Working in the healthcare field, we were given the opportunity to work with pediatric patients who had incurable cancers or inoperable tumors that were in locations in their brain or their spinal cord that no surgeon would touch, and that their families had to sit there and watch them die slowly. How do we explain that? Many people say, well, there isn't a God, or maybe people say, I don't know, but I still believe in God. But thanks to Spiritism, we're able to understand that even if we don't know the exact details of why that particular child or children are going through those things, we know that God's justice is in the plurality of lives. There's a case that we've shared here before at the SSB. A case of when Chico, who did lots of charity work with his team, in one particular case of a young man, let's just say he's in his 20s, very debilitated, born with a disease that I'm not even sure which one it was, but he had physical deformities where he was basically what we call in the medical field contracted. I don't know the layman's terms for that, sorry. But just, he was contracted all up into like a ball. And he used to go and they would help the mother and help him as well and do what they can, and they would leave. And one day one of his workers said to him, Chico, wouldn't it have been better for this spirit, this soul, to not even been born or to die early on? I mean, Chico, really, what is he accomplishing? He has no pormentation, meaning his mind is not that great. Look at his body. He'll never get married or have any kids. I mean, really, Chico, tell me, what is the point? Would we all have thought that? Perhaps have thought that. But interesting, Chico, with his amazing mediumship and his wonderful guide, Emmanuel, permitted that he share the following with his team, his co-worker, team worker, his colleague in the Spiritist work. He said to him, this spirit, or this soul who was incarnated, was a, let's use the word criminal, so to speak, and had committed great atrocities. And that for a very long time in the lower zones, his enemies persecuted him relentlessly for a long time. And so the good and noble spirits had realized that the only opportunity that this particular man, young man, had to give a break from his obsessors is to disguise him in this physical form. It's the only way for him to have some mental peace, at least for however long he wound up living. So nothing in God's kingdom is useless. In the literature we read this throughout. Nothing that God does is useless, and nothing that he allows to happen is useless. And that is difficult to swallow when we see the tragedy of today. But there's also comfort in it. Even though people like to say, well, I want to see that criminal punished today. I'm a spiritist, but I want to see him punished today. God is not a God of punishing. He's a God of educating. He's a loving God. He's not one who sends us to eternal damnation, as some Orthodox religions believe. Even though as we read and we're studying on Thursdays the book Torments of Obsession, we learn about these true hells that exist in the spirit realm. Figuratively speaking, we say the word hell because it's a common term. But it's like a hell. Ones we read about in Greek mythology, these lower zones that have been sort of created by the minds of these brothers and sisters who are still in this errant state. But we have solace that God is just, and that with time, and sometimes it's a long time, but with time and successive reincarnations, we come to understand. So reincarnation is not only spiritist literature, it's not only in other cultures, belief systems, it's also in the Bible. As we mentioned in the beginning of our talk today, there's also a famous text about the prophet Elijah and how his own disciples asked him about it. And let's just read it here, Matthew chapter 11, verses 13 through 14. For all the prophets in the law have prophesied until John. And if you are willing to receive it, he is Elijah who was to come. And furthermore, and the disciples asked him, saying, why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? But he answered them and said, Elijah indeed is to come and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah has come already, and they did not know him, but did to him whatever they wished. So also shall the Son of Man suffer at their hand. Then the disciples understood that he had spoken of John the Baptist. There's even in different chapters of the other Gospels, similar text. So we see here that it's so clear that even Jesus is referring to reincarnation here, that John the Baptist was Elijah. So there's something for us to think about. And this is good. As spiritists, when we encounter those who say, well, reincarnation's not in the Bible, you can say, I remember that day when Kirsten was talking about reincarnation and she mentioned something about Elijah and Matthew. So you can go back to the book of Matthew and read about it, and the other Gospels as well. So what is the objective of reincarnation? Do we all know what the objectives are? Can someone name one? Improvement? Anyone else other than improvement? Evolution? That's, yeah, kind of the same. Learning. What about redressing previous mistakes? We say redress because we don't want to say the more punishing terminology, which is, to pay for our sins, which is a very punishing terminology, because that's not what it's about. It's about coming back and learning. How about affecting human progress? We don't think about that oftentimes. We think about oftentimes, I have to pay back what I got. If I'm suffering today, maybe it's because I did something in my previous lifetime. In the law of reproduction, it's the second natural law in part 3 of the Spirit's book. It's interesting. You wouldn't think of the law of reproduction would touch on reincarnation, or maybe you would think so. But they talk about the human races and how they evolve and how reincarnation explains that. And that Kardec actually asked the spirits, and I'm going to paraphrase the question here. And you can go, it's like the first 5 questions of the law of reproduction, 5 to 10. And Kardec asked the spirits, well, again, we paraphrase, is it wrong when man intervenes in science and nature to sort of push it forward, to help things along? And we see great minds who do this. great minds who contribute to the progress of science, nature. One great mind there's many great minds, so if we don't mention all of them, forgive us. But someone who comes to our mind right now is Rudolf Steiner. Fantastic mind. Wrote an amazing book, many books. In actuality, I think he didn't really write books. People transcribed it and published it. He gave a lot of lectures in his time. He died, I believe it was in 1925. But people adopted his belief system. But he was known to really affect human progress in many areas, one of which is in education. Today in Baltimore, we have a fantastic school called the Waldorf School, being pronouncing it correctly. Has an amazing educational idea. Pestalozzi, centuries ago, more than a century ago, also affected human progress. Marie Curie, many people affected human progress. If we didn't have reincarnation, if it didn't exist, the barbarians who existed centuries ago would still be here. How come our society, the people who are living in it, are changing? Thomas Jefferson, for instance, also affected human progress. We had the blessed opportunity of actually visiting one of his homes that became a museum, and we see all of the things that he created to make our lives easier. Steve Jobs created the iPad, really makes a lot of people's lives easier, amongst other things. He created the iPad amongst other people as well. And the next phrase, to purify ourselves, can be controversial in the sense that some have a difficulty with the idea of purifying, because it sort of gives a negative connotation from perhaps more orthodox religions. So let's understand what the word purification means. We mean it as defined in the dictionary. It's the opposite of selfishness. It's not perfection in the negative sense, but it's just the opposite of all the negative vices. It's embracing all of the virtues to the fullest. That would be our definition of purification. And also we can go to questions 167 through 171 of the Spirit's book and learn more about what we just discussed. And lastly, purification is to free ourselves from guilt or quote-unquote evil, negative habits, vices. We already gave a whole lecture before on how to be a virtuous person. Leo has talked about the many virtues, give a slide with hundreds of virtues. It's when we are aiming towards that in each lifetime. So, okay, you say, Kirsten, okay, I understand that. Well, what about when I'm having coffee with my friend who does not believe in reincarnation at all? Well, we're going to tell you something. We're not here to say that you should go around converting people. If someone is happy in their religion, is being a good person, that's wonderful. That's fantastic. That's what religion is supposed to do. It's supposed to make us better people, get closer to God, become more spiritual, aware. So we don't mention these types of evidence of reincarnation for you to go out and say, here, world, reincarnation exists. No, we share it because it is a fact. Dr. Ian Stevenson was famous for publishing a lot of his research, although we won't necessarily mention him specifically or show any of his books that have been published over the years, but he's just one of many. Of course, there's lots and tons of research that's done in Brazil that's published also in English. But without even looking at the research, everyday things that each person in this room, to some degree or another, have either experienced it or know someone who's experienced it. Déjà vu, if we've been pronouncing that term correctly. We learned it as déjà vu. What is that? When you go to a place, you feel like you've been there before? What about spontaneous flashes? Remembrances from the past. Strong emotion. This is interesting. This is interesting. Some have experienced this, some have not. Sometimes when we are under strong emotion, when something happens to us, and then we say something to someone, and they say, and it's almost prophetic, or something that we didn't think that person should have known, but out of strong emotion, they've said it to us, and we think, why did I say that? Sometimes, as Joanna de Angelis tells us in many of her books, specifically her book that's entitled Existential Conflict, she talks about sometimes there are things in our lives that trigger past life memories. In the Spiritist literature, they touch on this. Strong emotion. Spontaneous experiences of young children. And this is what correlates with Dr. Ian Stevenson. A lot of his research that he did was with children. We can see, or have seen, or have experienced young children claiming to have been someone else. But it's very natural. There's a book, I believe, yes, we still have it. It's called Reborn for Love by Hernani Andrade, who's a Brazilian researcher. It's published in English. It's very good. He presents a lot of research, but one case that struck him the most and why he published that book was a case of a mother and her, I believe it was her fourth child. And permit us as we tell you very briefly, it's very interesting. Because when she was a teenager, she was sent to be taught at a convent, not to live there, but just be taught by the nuns. And there was a young priest who she had this immediate spiritual attraction for. We don't say physical because, at least in the book, it doesn't depict it like that. But they had this immediate attraction, and she was 14, and he was maybe already in his 20s, possibly in his 30s. And there's an account of the mother who's recalling her teenage years when she talks about this priest and how much she admired him and the way he used to speak and the relationship they had, not physical, not romantic, but just a strong emotional attachment she had for him that even at that age she didn't understand. But she says that she had so much respect for him, and he also never tried to take advantage of her. And he could have, because she said she was very impressionable, she was a young teenage girl, but he always showed his respect. And then she grew up, they lost touch, she moved out of the convent, went on with the rest of her life. The rest of the details you can read there, but it's interesting. Is that many years later, she has children, she gets married, she has her fourth son. And what's interesting is that when she's pregnant with the fourth son, how she decides to, I believe it's the middle name or the first name, she gave her son two, it's like, families who's, like, for instance, my daughter's name's Sarah Grace, but nobody calls her Grace. It's like that way for many people. You have two names. So her son, whose first name wasn't, let's call him, I believe it's Kilden, was Kilden Jonathan, or something like that. But he always wanted to be called Jonathan, which, by the way, was the name of the priest who, in that same lifetime, she was very spiritually attracted to. But it wasn't so much on purpose, like she gave him, she just always liked the name, so she said. It just so happens her fourth child, who was a boy, she gave him that middle name. But the son wanted to be called Jonathan. And on many different occasions, he used to turn to her and say, "Mom, remember when we were back living in the convent?" And he began retelling these experiences, these private, very private experiences she used to have with the priest. And she used to look at him, not understanding what was going on, as if she were retelling the story of her relationship with that priest. So naturally, she came to know of this researcher, and long story short, they took all this evidence, they interviewed the young boy, and they put two and two together. And based upon all the information the boy had, because here's one interesting thing that I did not mention. She never found out how the young priest died. In actuality, once she began thinking that her son was the incarnation of the priest, she tried to go and research how he died. But no one really seemed to know. It took a very long time and arduous researching to look at this place, that place, because her son was claiming how he died when he was the priest. That he died while turning on a curve of road on a motorcycle. Well, how many priests do you know drive motorcycles? I mean, even if the boy had seen a picture of his mother with this priest, how would he know that he drove a motorcycle? It's not something common for priests to drive. It's not. So he said, Mom, I remember when I died, when I was driving my motorcycle too fast around this curve, and I bumped my head, and then that was it. And she thought that was curious because she tried going to the old convent, and they said he was transferred someplace else, and then transferred here and there, and finally, years later, when her son was already grown up, getting older, and not remembering, she found the records of how he died. How did he die? Motorcycle accident. And there was no way up until that point that she knew how he died. So there's many little things that had occurred that some people can say, some might say, coincidence. He saw on this TV or that, he saw a picture. Maybe. But there's too many facts that add up. And he also was having many dreams, as many children do, or even adults as well. Remember things happening to them that didn't happen in this life. But we make the connections, we feel it. Oftentimes we just have to look at our tendencies. What we love or like to do a lot can come from many past lives. These are just the everyday things we can think about. We don't have to necessarily Google the research that has been done. But one interesting thing we had to share, how spirits incarnate. We talk about why we reincarnate, the purpose behind it. How do we incarnate? It's interesting because in the Genesis, they tell us, and we apologize for the long text, but it's very interesting because it's significant because we see how much time, care, and love is put into our incarnation. When the spirit must incarnate in a human body that is about to be formed, a fluidic tie, which is nothing but an extension of its paraspirit, connects it to the zygote, to which it is attracted by an irresistible force from the moment of conception. As the fetus develops, the tie tightens. And further, it says, the paraspirit is united molecule by molecule to the body that is forming. But incarnation is only complete at birth. So it's interesting because in the Spirit's book, there's many questions about this as well, telling us this, that truly, when the baby is born, the incarnation is complete. And up till then, sometimes the spirit, under strong will, it can retract. And that's why when we talk about the very difficult subject of abortion, we see that all this planning that the divine spirits go into, connecting the paraspirit molecule by molecule, and then someone cuts that, it's difficult for both involved, both the mother, and we don't say it out of judgment. This is just the literature. This is not something we are coming here and judging anybody, because that is for God, and God himself doesn't judge. He only educates. So something for us to think about, that there is a lot of planning detail that goes in to our incarnation. And in this book, Missionaries of the Light, there's a story of the case, rather, of the reincarnation of Segismundo. Beautiful case. You've heard it over and over again. I didn't want to tire you with the case, but it's beautiful. They go into detail about how the incarnation, they talk about this very thing. Molecule by molecule, we are united. And it's a huge responsibility as well, molecule by molecule. But we did want to read to you this little part, the case of Zulmira and baby Julio, because it's interesting. When, and this is after for all intents and purposes, the mother's already pregnant, that Clarencio and Andrea Louise go to observe the pregnant mother. And Andrea Louise says the following with Clarencio. We noticed that Giulio, who was the spirit being prepared to incarnate, was already connected because the mother's already pregnant. We noticed that Giulio's subtle body had undergone an enormous but startling change. It had shrunk considerably. It seemed to me that both he and Zulmira, which is the mother, were soul with soul, were immersing into each other. The young woman had acquired physical fullness and spiritual vivacity, whereas the boy was losing his outward appearance. Giulio had peacefully gone to sleep, whereas Zulmira displayed a remarkable awakening to life. It's interesting for us to read this. It's interesting to know the process as well. And Clarencio even clarifies and says, reincarnation, like discarnation, is one of the most telling biological shocks. You can go read the book yourself in this particular chapter. It's fascinating when they go into depth about reincarnation. And it's here for sale. It's a beautiful, enlightening book called Between Heaven and Earth. And we have to mention this as well when we talk about reincarnation. People often ask us or themselves, well, what about heredity? Well, I know that I have debts I have to pay off, but genetics says that I get genes from my mom and my dad, so how does that play into spiritism? It does play into spiritism. And we're going to read you a text from the same book, Clarencio. Because Andrea Louise, having been a physician, asked that very question. So Clarencio answers like this. Heredity, as understood scientifically, has its limits. Of course, parents and children, even when far apart morally speaking, always maintain a mutual magnetic affinity. Thus, the parents furnish certain resources to the reincarnating spirit, but such resources depend on the needs of the soul that uses them. When it boils down to it, we are actually heirs of ourselves. So depending upon the necessity that we have in this lifetime, depending upon what trials or lessons we must learn, will depend upon actually which genes we attract during this reincarnation process. It's interesting. There's many behind-the-scenes story of this particular case, but because of time and because we encourage you to read the book to learn more about it. So since we talked about how the spirit gets connected, let's touch briefly on this 3 aspects of what we are: the spirit, paraspirit, and physical body. So let's understand something. You have the physical body that's entirely material, then you have the spirit that's of etheric, right? You need to have an interface. They somehow need to communicate. That's where the paraspirit comes through. But this is interesting. Leon Denis tells us in the book, After Death, which has another translation as well, every action, every thought is stored in the paraspirit. Every action, every thought is stored in the paraspirit. Every, not some. It doesn't say a few, a couple. Every action and thought. So if our paraspirit is deformed for some reason because of years of some type of abuse or anything, it'd be difficult. I wish my pointer would work. When the spirit is trying to communicate, he's going to have difficulty in translating that back. If my interface doesn't work properly, it cannot communicate that message to the physical body. And that's how we can understand a lot of diseases. It's sort of the mechanism here. But also the Gospel according to Spiritism, item 14, it says the paraspirit undergoes successive transformations. It becomes more etheric until it reaches perfection. That's interesting. Because we think, well, the aim of reincarnation is for me to become perfect, to work on myself, to work on my virtues. My paraspirit also goes under transformations. And this is significant when we go to other worlds. When more evolved, higher worlds, that's why those spirits are able to visit other worlds more readily. But this we can read much more about in the Gospel and also in the Genesis by Kardec. As we discussed about that, these divine and noble spirits, there's so much planning that goes into our incarnation. It's not like two people get together and bingo, bango, genetics, and then you have a child. It's actually much more than that. It's beyond what physical eyes can see. In No Solar, they talk about this ministry of reincarnation. And it's talked about in the Missionaries of the Light, in No Solar, and in other different books, where spirits with merit are able to go and partake in choosing of their next body, which type of body they're going to have. So it is very well planned out by the good and noble spirits. It's not just randomized, whatever you want. You want blonde hair? Sure, go ahead. It's much more in depth than that. As we're learning from studying the book Missionaries of the Light, some spirits have no say-so. Some spirits actually reincarnate directly from the lower zones. Directly. Some of them could be our children, have been our children. Maybe we're our neighbors. We don't know. That's the beauty of Spiritism. We don't know things so detailed where we can go and judge our neighbor. We can speculate, which isn't always good. But we should seek to assist one another. Because there's a lot that goes into our planning of our lives. So imagine when we get off track, it's not only bad for us, but think about all the planning that was done. Even those that were born out of the lower zones, there's a ton of planning that goes into that. It's not like, okay, guys, go ahead, off in the lower zones, boom, just go reincarnate. No, there's planning. There's planning for all of us. There's significance in our reincarnation. For one, is in the Gospel, it strengthens family ties, where a single life would destroy them. Perhaps some of us may have issues with our family. You say, well, Kirsten, I really don't like my sisters anyway, so I don't need to believe reincarnation. I don't want to see them anyway. Well, there must be someone we have a great affinity with, a neighbor who we love dearly. I mean, we do love our brothers and sisters, blood brothers and sisters, or a cousin, and you want and hope to see them. We recently saw, I believe it was on 2020 or one of those news shows that's broadcasted at night, they actually were following a story of how nowadays there's this thing being implemented. It actually has been implemented for years and years. People making their living will, and how they're trying to help people that are actually actively dying to work on that. I know it sounds bizarre, maybe to some who are in the healthcare field, but for those who are, it's not bizarre. You hope that people, and we hope that our own families do this. Well, the reason why I mention this is because one particular interview they did was of a husband and wife, and it was a second marriage for both of them, but they had been married for about 20-some years. And they asked a series of questions, and they allowed them to tape it. And one of the most moving moments was when the woman, who I believe she was a nurse practitioner, was asking what is your greatest fear to the man who had metastatic lung cancer? What is your greatest fear? He turns to his wife of 20-some years and turns back to the nurse practitioner and says, of never seeing her again. That's moving. And we wish we could say, wait, you're going to see her again. Don't worry. Because we want to see our loved ones again and strengthen the love we already have for them. And naturally, we mentioned rectifying past errors. The tragedy today that occurred, perhaps we could speculate that what occurred today, not speculate, we know for sure that divine justice occurred, that divine law was in place and is working, that if those children weren't meant to go that way, that God will take care of it. In the great scheme, the great plans of life, there's a reasoning behind it that we just don't know of yet. But the beauty of reincarnation is that we can rectify our past errors. And also developing our morality and our intellect. And this happens in some lives. We develop more of our intellect. In other lives, we develop more of our morality. Reincarnation also generates universal love, as something that the Dalai Lama said, and brotherhood. Because in one life, I'm born in Brazil, I love my culture, but guess what? Next life, you're born in China. You have to learn how to love that culture. So it teaches us to embrace all different types of cultures and to appreciate it, and to also learn more tolerance, being born in different cultures and social and religious backgrounds or arenas. It forces us to look at that. But we say all of this. We share all of this. A lot of it technical, maybe some of it boring to some of us because it's repetitive. Kirsten, I've heard this already. But there's one thing about Spiritism that is so comforting to our hearts, especially in the wake of what happened in this most recent tragedy. And unfortunately, at the level that our planet is at, we're going to see these things. But there's one thing that is so comforting for us in the Spiritist literature, is something that Givaldo actually said. He's quoted, we're quoting him, and many people quote this particular phrase. He says that the mission of Spiritism has not come to combat the social misery of the world, to give food, clothing, which are all good things. But Givaldo says that's not the mission of Spiritism. The mission of Spiritism is to combat moral misery. Why? Because it is in the moral misery that creates all the other miseries. It's moral misery that created the event of today. Lack of morality. In a famous phrase of Spiritism, without charity there's no salvation. There's a famous quote in the Bible that Jesus says, whoever feeds him is feeding me. Whoever clothes the other is clothing me. When I was thirsty, you fed me. What about when people come to our Spiritist centers that are suffering? What if we were a Spirit center in Connecticut and we were seeking to help those who just suffered the most recent tragedies or recent events? How do I implement this charity? Without charity, there's no salvation. What salvation are they talking about? Taking someone who is in misery, an emotional, depressive abyss, and be able to help them out, even on some level, to let them know that they are not alone. This is a charity that comes from our heart, the depths of our heart, that doesn't wait for anyone to tell them, but they go and we do it. So this is our mission as well, as we stand up here and we share, is to not necessarily combat social misery, although it's great to go and help, because we should, but it's to go to the root of the problem, which is our lack of morality. So let's remember this phrase. It's the last phrase we're leaving up here. Without charity, there's no salvation. Because when I do good to others, it also reflects back to me, says Dr. Stephen Post in his research. You can Google it. So we leave you with these thoughts. Think about them, because we know even as we think about good, we're emitting positive waves and vibrations. And as we transition to our passes and do our visualization, we will leave some room to send our prayers to those who most recently suffered in Connecticut. Because even though Spiritism can explain probably what happened, it doesn't mean that we're here to judge or cast down the young man who's not well, but it's to send him our prayers. Because guess what? One day he will be well. One day he will be. So we're going to transition to the second part of our meeting tonight.